Ghost stories from the Pickwick Papers. Charles Dickens' forgotten spooky side. When most people think of Charles Dickens, they think of Oliver asking for more gruel, or Scrooge being visited by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve. They think of fog-covered streets, grim workhouses, and long dramatic novels with a cast of characters the size of a small town. What they probably don't think of is ghost stories. But here is the thing. Dickens loved a good scare. Long before anyone had ever heard of A Christmas Carol, he was tucking dark, eerie little tales into the pages of his very first novel. And in 1987, these stories got their own animated film. It's called Ghost Stories from the Pickwick Papers. It runs for just under an hour, and it's one of the most pleasantly odd things to come out of 1980s animation. Today we're going to look back at what it is, where it came from, and why it deserves to be remembered. It all started with Dickens. To understand the film, you need to understand the book it comes from. The Pickwick Papers was Charles Dickens' very first novel, published in serial form between 1836 and 1837. It follows a well-meaning gentleman named Samuel Pickwick and his friends as they travel around England, getting into all sorts of misadventures. It is funny, warm and packed with colourful characters, but scattered through the novel, told by the characters around fires and inns, are a handful of ghost stories. Dark little tales that feel completely different from the rest of the book. Dickens used these stories almost like short breaks from the main adventure, giving readers something eerie and atmospheric in between the comedy. And 3 of those stories became the backbone of the 1987 animated film. Ghost Stories from the Pickwick Papers was made in 1987 by Emerald City Productions, in partnership with D.L. Taffner Productions. It runs at just under an hour in total, with 3 separate stories told one after the other. The animation is modest. This was not a big budget production by any stretch, but it has charm and an atmosphere that holds up surprisingly well. It has a rating of 7.3 on IMDb, which is a solid score for something this obscure, and people who remember watching it as children tend to remember it very fondly. It was released on VHS and found its audience through home video, the kind of tape that got passed around or spotted on shelves at the video rental shop. It was also shown on TV in the 1980s, which is also where a lot of people may remember it. Today it exists in a curious in-between space, too old to be on any streaming service, too loved by those who saw it to be completely forgotten. Story 1. The Ghost in the Wardrobe. The first story follows a young law student who moves into an old rooming house. It is the kind of place with creaking floorboards, dark corridors, and a general air of something not quite right. It turns out that this house comes with a resident ghost. At first, the student is understandably unsettled, but as the story goes on, the relationship between the two, the living and the dead sharing the same space, takes some unexpected turns. It builds quietly and steady to a conclusion that catches you off guard. For a story aimed at young audiences, it handles the supernatural with a real sense of atmosphere rather than just cheap frights. Story 2. The Mail Coach Ghosts. The second story is arguably the most adventurous of the 3. A young man falls asleep and finds himself transported back in time, or perhaps sideways into another world entirely. He discovers a beautiful young woman being held captive by a ruthless nobleman and his henchmen. Naturally, he decides to rescue her. What follows is a race against time through a foggy, dangerous world full of old mail coaches and dark roads. It has the feel of a gothic romance mixed with a ghost story, and it moves at a genuinely exciting pace. Viewers who remember this one as children often cite it as a favourite of the 3. Story 3. The Goblin and the Gravedigger, my personal favourite. The third and final story is the strangest of the bunch, and perhaps the most purely Dickensian. It follows a gravedigger who finds himself dragged before the king of the goblins and put on trial for his life. The setting is fiery and otherworldly, somewhere beneath the earth where goblins hold court, and the rules of the living world do not apply. It is vivid, strange and theatrical, exactly the kind of story that Dickens loved to tell. Think of it as a nightmare with a moral buried inside it. The Gravedigger is not exactly a hero, and the goblins are not exactly villains, and by the end you are left with something that feels more like a dark fable than a straightforward ghost story. A side of Dickens most people will never see. What makes this film genuinely interesting is what it reveals about Dickens as a writer. Most people know him for his long social novels, the ones about poverty, injustice and the hard edges of Victorian life. But Dickens had a deep love of the supernatural. He wrote ghost stories throughout his career, hosted ghost story evenings with friends, and was fascinated by the idea that the world of the living and the world of the dead were never far apart. The ghost stories in the Pickwick Papers were one of his earliest experiments with that darker side. They are not the polished ghost stories of his later years, but they have a raw, inventive energy that is really something to experience. The 1987 animated film captures that energy surprisingly well. So why is it hard to find? Like so many animated films of the 1980s, ghost stories from the Pickwick Papers never made it past the VHS era. At the time there was no DVD release, no Blu-ray, and it is not turned up on any major streaming platforms. Copies of the original VHS tape still turn up on eBay from time to time, but beyond that, it is genuinely difficult to track down. There are some DVDs that do come available online, but whether they're official, I don't know. It's the sort of film that exists mostly in the memories of people who caught it on television as children, or found it at a video shop on a rainy afternoon. Those people, almost without exception, remember it warmly. There is something fitting about that actually. A collection of ghost stories quietly haunting the edge of people's memories for decades. Dickens would probably have approved. Ghost Stories from the Pickwick Papers is a small, strange and surprisingly effective piece of animation. It takes three of Dickens' most overlooked stories and brings them to life with a genuine atmosphere and care. It isn't polished, it's not famous, and it's not easy to find. But it is absolutely worth seeking out. Especially if you fancy something a little eerie, a little old-fashioned, and a little bit different. Dickens spent his whole career telling stories that people could not put down. It turns out that even his ghost stories, buried in the pages of his very first book, have managed to stick around. Some stories just refuse to stay dead.